Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In a recent video, one of our viewers, Nickelraptor, asked the following question. How would the Empire have fared if they built 100,000 Gladiator Class Star Destroyers instead of 25,000 Imperial Class Star Destroyers, which basically make up the backbone of the Imperial fleet? Well, that's actually a really good question, Nickelraptor. Thanks for sending that out to us, and honestly, I couldn't have chosen a better ship than the Gladiator. You did a great job choosing the ship for this scenario. A lot of people probably would have went with the more common and well-known Victory Class Star Destroyer for this scenario. The Victory Class is very much just the first iteration of the Imperial Class Star Destroyer. It also had excessive amounts of turbo lasers on board, and it was primarily designed for planetary bombardments and engaging in broadside exchanges with other capital ships. It basically did everything the Imperial Class Star Destroyer did, but just not as well. It was also smaller and had less guns. It's probably cheaper to operate, but not necessarily better. The Gladiator Class Star Destroyer, however, offers something completely different when it comes to capabilities. It was just designed for something very different compared to the Victory and the Imperial. First, let's talk cost though. The Gladiator Class Star Destroyer costs 34 million credits per unit. That's compared to the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, which is closer to 150 million per unit. So this is where Nickelraptor gets that 100,000 number for the Gladiator Class Star Destroyer. He's assuming that the Gladiator costs about a fourth of what the Imperial Class Star Destroyer costs. Although, if we are nitpicking, the real number should be more like 110,300 Gladiator Class Star Destroyers, because they're cost about, you could build basically 4.4 of these Gladiators for every Imperial Class Star Destroyer. And this is perfect because, the biggest problem that the Empire faced was just the sheer size of the territory it had to hold. In order to properly protect all of its holdings, the Empire needed a massive and probably very cheap fleet. Palpatine, through the nationalization of entire manufacturing sectors and the seizure of entire planets of natural resources, managed to create a military-industrial complex that had an incredible scale and low cost per unit as a result. But they still had roughly around 1,000 sectors and only 25,000 capital ships, or 25,000 Imperial Class Star Destroyers, to patrol that area. That's an average of just 25 Imperial Class Star Destroyers per each sector fleet. Now that sounds like a lot, but you have to consider how big a sector actually is. Take the Chommel sector, for instance, a sparsely populated mid-rim sector home to Naboo. It had 36 full number worlds, but it also had 40,000 settled dependencies. We're talking about moons, space stations, derelict ships, asteroids, planets. It's a lot of people, a lot of places to go. There's also an additional 300 million barren stars in this part of the galaxy. So as you can see, 25 Imperial Class Star Destroyers is hardly enough to even cover all of the member worlds at the same time, let alone look for, rebel hideouts and all of those other barren star systems. Now, if you had closer to 110 Gladiator Class Star Destroyers, that would change the equation somewhat, because you'd be able to deploy 4 times as many ships of this size. Increased visibility of the Imperial fleet is definitely a deterrent that will work to dissuade petty crime and smaller bandit outfits. Now, it's obviously not enough to patrol every part of the sector, but again, these Star Destroyers aren't really designed for your average patrols, right? You have frigates, corvettes, even smaller things like the Galactic Class cruiser, which was really just a freighter that was armed. I mean, you could literally have thousands of these in a sector patrolling the hyperspace lanes. The Star Destroyers are really more of a quick reaction force. They're designed for when you have a serious problem, like you call the SWAT team. If you have too many rebel fighters flying around and you can't just, dislodge them from wherever they are, you call in a Star Destroyer. And the Gladiator, despite being a lot smaller than the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, still can fit that role, because 600 meters is a pretty large-sized vessel, all things considered. But what is this Gladiator class actually capable of? Well, it's smaller than both the 900-meter-long Victory and the 1.6-kilometer-long Imperial class. But I actually think at 600 meters, it's in a sweet spot. Anything around 400 to 700 meters is what you ideally want in a kind of more robust escort or patrol vessel. In most navies, a ship like this would be classified as a frigate or cruiser class ship. The Imperial Navy, on the other hand, still designates the Gladiator class as a Star Destroyer, although that might be because of its capabilities or for propaganda reasons. Although in some manuals, it does describe this ship as an escort frigate, which I think is a much better designation. So originally, this ship was designed as an escort ship for the Victory Class Star Destroyer, but once the Empire took over, you had other ships filling that role, and this ship was reassigned as a long-range patrol craft, which I think is a great idea, actually. So why do I like ships of this size? Well, I think it's really the smallest you can get without sacrificing that dominance you would want from an Imperial task force wherever it is in the galaxy. And that's because most pirate fleets, bandits, and insurgent groups have trouble mustering ships larger than the frigate class. Take a look at the Rebellion. I mean, for most of the early conflict, the CR-90 Corvette was it. It formed the backbone of its fleet and served as a command ship for smaller fleets. At just 150 meters in length, these ships were small and nimble, and I would argue that the ISD was complete overkill to tackle them. If anything, they're almost too big, where like the size of the ISD was a negative when fighting something as small as a CR-90. If you guys have read the Twilight Company, that was a military unit which was based off of the CR-90, and they had a gunship with them, a Brachatook class gunship, which is even smaller than the CR-90, and it went toe-to-toe with the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, and it was just really hard to hit this gunship while it's flying in between at close ranges and knocking out all of its turbo lasers. So again, the ISD is fearsome, but it's not really effective against smaller ships at all. And when the rebels started stealing bigger ships like the Nebula B class frigate, they're still kind of manageable for the Gladiator Class Star Destroyer. I would say that you would need at least 2 Nebula B class frigates to take out a Gladiator. And then even the Mon Calamari cruiser that would represent the largest ship used by the rebels would not completely overwhelm a Gladiator's defenses. When you're selecting a navy, it's all about finding balance, striking a balance between firepower and also like costs. And when it comes to the Gladiator, not only is it very effective in almost every combat situation, it's also extremely cheap to operate for a ship of its size. For instance, the Gladiator Class Star Destroyer only needs a crew of around 1,255 people. Compare that to the Imperial Class Star Destroyer with 40,000 crew on board, and that is a crazy difference. The ISD requires literally 30 times more people just to fly around. That's tens of thousands of people they have to put through the Imperial Academy system. You have to train and pay for their education. I mean, that's a lot of cost. The Gladiator, despite being an older vessel, clearly is highly optimized. I'm assuming there are many automated systems on board to decrease manpower needs, probably a necessity during the Clone Wars when the clones were outnumbered by the droids like 1,000 times to 1. The Empire is a pretty cheap faction, and you know what? They have a lot of manpower. They have a lot of people, and so I wouldn't be surprised if they designed the ISD without automation, strictly because they just had so many bodies to throw around. And if you take a look at the First Order, which follows the Empire, they actually have a lot of ISDs as well, and they actually had to redesign all these ships to have a lot smaller crew, basically because they didn't have the manpower. And all they did was just automate systems using droids and computers, something they probably should have done a lot earlier. The Gladiator is just a much more modern ship when it comes to design. For instance, it has an entirely automated torpedo bay with conveyor belts, mechanical arms to choose what munition you want, load it straight into the launchers, and this is all controlled from the bridge. That's how ships should be designed. This also speaks to one of the major differences between the armament on an ISD and the Gladiator. The ISD, for all intents and purposes, is a battleship, a mobile, forward operations base that has a tremendous amount of fire support bolted onto it. If you place one of these things over the battlefield, you can simultaneously strike 100 different targets with insanely heavy firepower. Great for a conflict like the Clone Wars when you're going up against an entrenched traditional, foe like the Separatist droid army. Not so great for patrols, though. I don't think it's nearly as useful, especially because you're mostly fighting pirates and bandits who are going to be flying around in things that are probably too small and fast to track with a turbo laser. I feel like people don't realize just how big one turbo laser emplacement is. I mean, think about the gigantic gun emplacements that Hitler had on the Atlantic Wall. Well, many times that size. It's a multi-story building more than anything, with crew numbering in the dozens. And the ISD had 60 heavy turbo laser batteries or towers. It also had 60 ion cannons and an assortment of other types of line-of-sight direct fire energy weapons, along with about 10 tractor beams. As you can see, the ISD had a lot of firepower, but all the firepower it could do was shoot in a straight line at something that it could see. It's kind of a limited ship. The Gladiator, on the other hand, has a wider range of capabilities, despite being a much smaller vessel. This ship, for instance, has 12 light dual turbo laser turrets. For heavier ships it might encounter, like a pirate frigate or rebel corvette. These turrets are also fast enough to actually track smaller vessels as well. The Gladiator also has 10 medium point defense laser turrets, specifically for taking out those pesky little snub fighters the rebels like to use. And unlike the ISD, this thing also had 10 missile launchers that could fire a variety of different munitions, from proton torpedoes concussion missiles to ion torpedoes. This is one of my biggest criticisms of the Imperial fleet, just the lack of smart munitions or guided munitions. I understand from a cost-cutting point of view, turbo lasers are cheaper per shot, but they have some limitations. And when your entire ship just depends on one specific type of weapon system, it is a problem. And the Gladiator Class Star Destroyer really doesn't have those problems. And that, again, might be because it was originally designed as an escort frigate. It's supposed to tackle smaller ships, and that is the majority of the threats that the Empire is going to be facing for most of its time and power. And so right off the bat, the Gladiator is basically well suited for like 95% of the problems the Empire faces, whereas the Imperial Class Star Destroyer is suitable for maybe like 5% of the problems the Empire faces. The Gladiator Class Star Destroyer might not be the most impressive ship, especially when people are talking about their favorite, massive Star Wars vessel, like the Subjugator, the Executor class, the Eclipse, or something else like that. But to a squadron of Rebel fighters, this thing is a death sentence. I mean, heck, if Tarkin just deployed like one of these ships during the Battle of Yavin, I think the Rebels would have lost. I mean, if they set the Gladiator to intercept the Rebel fleet, I don't think they would have even gotten close to the Death Star. And despite being much smaller than the ISD, the Gladiator class has 8 tractor beams, which again shows you that this is a ship designed for intercepting enemy starfighters. That's its main purpose. The ship also had a pretty decent complement of fighters on board, 24 in total. They're all deployed from a forward-facing hangar door along with 2 smaller doors on the side if the main door is either damaged or being guarded. This design is actually pretty awesome, not just from a tactical standpoint, but from a more historical point of view. See, the Gladiator looks very similar and has similar functions to the Sith Harrower class dreadnought used by the original Sith Empire in the wars against the Old Republic. It's really a classic design, kind of like when they brought back the Mustang, Charger, and Camaro. If it's good. If it's not broken, there's no need to fix it. And I think you could say that about this design. It's elegant, it looks great, and I love how the hangars are actually very functional and give multiple directions for pilots to exit to avoid ambushes. I was definitely not surprised when I found out that this ship was actually designed by Walix Blissix, a brilliant ship designer who later would defect to the rebellion from the Empire. He was also responsible for the creation of the Delta 7 Ether Sprite line of starfighters, along with several models that followed it, like the Alpha 3 Nimbus class V-Wing starfighter and the RZ-1A Wing. And I gotta say, the Rebels were really lucky that he defected when he did, because had he created a second version of the Gladiator and that had replaced the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, well, I think the Rebels would have had a much bigger problem fighting the Empire on its own terms. Ultimately, the Gladiator Class Star Destroyer can do everything that an ISD could do, if not more, against enemies like pirates and Rebel starfighter squadrons, at just a fraction of the price and manpower. Only in larger conventional fleet battles does the Gladiator have any weaknesses compared to the Imperial Class Star Destroyer. At the same time, I have to say, the Gladiator is not going to save the Empire, from itself, because the Empire has severe structural and economic problems that made the entire government just unsustainable in the long run. The problem wasn't the Imperial Class Star Destroyer. The problem was that the Empire had a culture that selected something as dumb as the Imperial Class Star Destroyer. The concentration of power in Palpatine's hands, combined with the impossible task of ruling an entire galaxy, was a much bigger problem than what kind of ships did the Empire's Navy deploy. But having said all that, the Gladiator is kind of perfect for patrolling, especially in the mid and outer rim, where the planets are kind of sparsely populated and far from each other. I think ultimately there would have been incremental improvements had they adopted the Gladiator. Maybe they could have even slowed down the Rebel alliance by a few years, killed some major leaders who otherwise would have escaped had they come under attack from an Imperial Class Star Destroyer. There you have it, guys. That is my assessment of the Gladiator. Once again, thank you for that question, Nickel Raptor. I enjoyed doing this video very much. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video as well. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.